Before going on to our next topic, let's focus on several aspects to bridge the gaps. The first issue is keyword static. We have already discussed it, so let's now review. Let's create a new class in our project. In package test, call this class myMath to tell it from the already existing class math. Let's create a public method which will return a number in the power of 2. Call it square. It will return int type, accept a number as a parameter. We will call it number and return this number squared. Let this method be public. Now to use this method, a new math class object is required. Although we don't need this object, we only want to use the method. It does not use instance variables, so we can write keyword static. Now let's call this method from the method main. myMath.square and pass it 20 as a parameter. Let's print out the result. Run the program. Everything works well. We have 400 displayed. You know this all. We have just reviewed it. Now in the same class, let's create a method which will accept a radius and return the circumference. The return type will be double. Let this method be public and static too. It returns type double. Call it length. The length of circumference. It will accept radius. Call this variable radius. To calculate the circumference of a circle, we must multiply 2 by pi and by r. We will use pi in other formulae too, so it is a good idea to create a special variable for it. Let's create it. We know that all the fields must be private, so let's write private. It will be of double type. Call it pi and assign it the value of 3.14. Now in method length, we will return 2 multiplied by pi and multiplied by a radius. Why have we encountered an error? Because a static method cannot refer to instance variables, and because to call this method we do not need an object at all. Thus, there are no instance variables for this method. So what should we do? The case is that if our variable also belongs to a class and not to an object, and can be declared as static, we'll be able to use it. Let's do just that. Private static double pi. Now we can address it from static methods. Let's call this method from method main and make sure everything works. Double length, assign symbol myMath.length, and pass it 10. Let's print out this variable. The circumference is 62 something. Everything works well. Now we have decided to take a vacation, and the substitute programmer is a D student. He is engaged in writing a static method which accepts a radius and returns the area of the circle. The area of the circle is pi multiplied by r squared, which means pi times r and times r. He gets to work and starts coding. The method will be public static, and the return type will be double. He calls it area. It accepts radius and double type too. It must return pi times radius times radius. Here the programmer notices that he is granted access to variable pi and decides that he must assign it some value, but he's forgotten what pi equals, so he writes pi equals 10. Now let's run the second method. We'll see what happens. We've got the circumference and printed it out. Now let's calculate the area. Double area equals math.area and pass it 10. Let's print out the area. Run the program. We can see that circumference is correct, but the area is not. It is so because pi does not equal 10, but it's the least of the problems. Let's print out the circumference of a circle with the radius of 10 centimeters. Variable length will be assigned the same value as it had myMath.length and pass it 10. We'll print this variable out again. Run the program. We can see that at first the method returned 62.8, and that is the correct answer. Then we printed out the area and afterwards method length started returning incorrect values. Now this is a problem indeed. The method written by another programmer now affects our method too. Why did that happen? Let's open class myMath, and here's this variable. It belongs to a class, not to an object. Therefore, when we call method length, this variable addresses this field and variable pi is assigned a correct value. Then we call method area and variable pi is assigned a different value. Now when we again call method length, it will be called for a new value of pi. To avoid this, we want to prevent the variable from changing its value when it's declared. To do this, we must add keyword final. If a variable is marked as final, it can be assigned a value only once. In this case, we assigned it a value the moment we declared it, so you can see an error in method area. We cannot assign values to a variable which is marked as final. A programmer can do nothing else but delete this line. And now this method returns a correct value and does not affect our methods. Provided that a variable is marked as static and final, it's usually given a name in the uppercase. Let's correct that and write pi in capital letters. If we simply do like that, we'll encounter errors wherever this variable is used, so we'll have to rename it also here and there. And if it's used anywhere else in the code, we must rename it there too. To avoid such situations, IDEA offers a better way. Click the variable, the name of which will change, and press Shift F6. Now write the value we want to assign, and IDEA will suggest us using capital letters for this value. Let's write it manually and press Enter. Now wherever this variable occurs, its name is already new. If the variable is marked as static and final, it's safe to make it public, because its value cannot be changed anyway. But if we can restrict access, we should go for it. And the last thing, it's high time we studied it. Within this class, let's create another method. This method will accept several int numbers and return the sum of these numbers. Let it be public static, and the return type will be int. Call this method sum. So what will we pass it as parameters? We don't know how many numbers the user may pass. Perhaps we can make a lot of overloading. Create the first method which will accept 1 parameter, 2 parameters, 3 parameters, 4, and so on. But which quantity will be enough? One option is to pass an array of numbers, something like this, and use a loop for summing up all numbers from this array and returning the values. But this method will be hard to call. because a new array of the numbers we need must be created and passed to this method. Java has such an option as passing variable length arguments. If we're not aware of how many parameters the user might pass, write the type of the variable, it's int in this case, then ... and the name of the variable. Let it be numbers too. Now when we call the method, we can pass it as many numbers as we wish, each separated by a comma. We may even not pass it numbers. Within a method, we can work with this variable as with an array. Thus, to print out the sum of numbers, let's create variable sum for storing the value, assign it an initial value of 0. Now iterate over the elements of numbers array, use for each loop. We assign the variable sum the value of every following element, and eventually we return variable sum. Let's open method main, call this method and save the result into variable sum. Type assign symbol, mymath.sum semicolon, and print out the value of variable sum. As you can see, there are no errors. If we use variable length arguments, we can do without passing values. In this case, the result will be 0. We can pass it one number, the value of 1. We can pass as many numbers as needed. We'll not encounter errors. Obviously, the method works correctly. Our lesson is over. I will not assign you homework today because the topic is quite simple. If something is not clear, watch the lesson again. The next lesson will not be a piece of cake, so you'd rather have a rest. Now you might find this pleasing. We'll delete this code. We no longer need these import operations because we are not using these classes. At the beginning of the course, all this code was just a set of fuzz words, and now you completely understand what each one of them means. A method is public. It means it's acceptable from any place in the program. If it's static, you don't have to create a new object of class main, because it belongs to a class, not to an object. By the way, this is why a program entry point must contain this method. At the launch of the program, there are no objects. It means a method is needed which does not require objects. This method does not return data, so its type is void. The name of the method is main. The parameters passed to it are an array of strings. They can be passed on the console when you launch the program, but do not bother about that. Throughout my career, I have never had to do this. That's all. Have a rest. See you in our next lesson.